In September 1988, in a control room aboard a research vessel bobbing in the Atlantic about 160 miles southeast of Charleston, South Carolina, a wall of monitors flickered with images relayed from nearly 8,000 feet below. A 6-ton remotely operated vehicle called the Nemo, piloted from the surface by a team of engineers who had built it themselves in a workshop in Columbus, Ohio, swept its lights across the ocean floor and illuminated what looked at first like a field of strange geological formations. Then the camera found the unmistakable silhouette of a massive sidewheel encrusted in a century of biological growth, and beyond it, scattered across an area roughly the size of a football field, a carpet of gold coins and ingots so dense that the sediment between them glinted under the floodlights. The man watching these images, the man who had spent the better part of a decade persuading 161 investors to give him $12.5 million to fund this very moment, was Tommy Thompson, a 36-year-old ocean engineer from Defiance, Ohio. He composed a message to shore that read, in part, "We have hit the mother lode." What happened next, over the following 3 decades, would become one of the strangest and most psychologically revealing stories in the history of the American pursuit of wealth. And it would have almost nothing to do with the ocean. To understand Tommy Thompson, you have to understand what he was before the gold. He was not a treasure hunter. He was an engineer, a tinkerer since childhood, the kind of mind that built an amphibious car as a teenager for the pleasure of driving unsuspecting passengers into a lake. After studying ocean engineering at Ohio State University, he went to work at the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, one of the most prestigious research laboratories in the country, an institution that had contributed to the development of everything from kitchen appliances to nuclear weapons. At Battelle, Thompson worked on classified deep-sea projects, including, reportedly, technology that helped the United States government extract intelligence from a sunken Soviet nuclear submarine while disguising the entire operation as routine oil rig work. His colleagues used a word that comes up repeatedly in accounts from that period: brilliant. He was called a rock star of deep-water engineering, but he was restless. The government and military contracts that funded deep-sea work were drying up, and Thompson wanted to keep going deeper. The question was how to pay for it. The answer, he decided, was gold. It was a practical calculation at first, or at least that is how Thompson framed it to himself and to others. He had spent a summer after high school working alongside career treasure hunters in Florida, men who spoke with romantic certainty about legendary wrecks and the fortunes they held. Thompson was not romantic. He was methodical. Together with Bob Evans, a geologist and polymath who would become the expedition's chief scientist, Thompson sifted through candidate shipwrecks with the rigor of an academic literature review. They settled on the SS Central America, a 280-foot sidewheel steamer that had gone down in a hurricane off the coast of South Carolina on September 12, 1857, carrying somewhere between 3 and 21 tons of California Gold Rush gold and taking 425 passengers and crew with it. The sinking was the maritime catastrophe of its era, a front-page tragedy that shook the country and contributed directly to the Panic of 1857, a financial crisis that cascaded through the banking system of the eastern seaboard. The Central America was, in the language of the men who hunted such things, the big one. What Thompson did next was not the work of a dreamer. He used Bayesian search theory, the same probabilistic framework the Navy had used to locate lost submarines, to narrow the wreck's likely location to a 1,400 square mile grid in water nearly 1.5 miles deep. He and Evans assigned probability scores to each square of the grid based on survivor accounts, historical weather data, and known current patterns. Then he went looking for money. Thompson showed up to meetings with Columbus's wealthiest citizens in a thrift store suit, his hair unkempt, and proceeded to deliver presentations so detailed, so rigorously structured, and so honest about the low probability of success that the investors found themselves charmed not by fantasy, but by competence. One after another, they wrote checks. The owner of the Columbus Dispatch put in $1 million. A developer whose 10,000 square foot luxury treehouse would later appear on an HGTV show contributed as well. 161 investors committed a total of $12.5 million. with further rounds eventually bringing the number of backers to around 300 and the total capital to roughly $22 million. Every one of them was told the odds were long. Every one of them believed that this particular man could beat them. Thompson and his team spent 2 summers searching and 1 summer exploring what turned out to be the wrong ship before the Nemo's cameras found the Central America in the late summer of 1988. The technology Thompson had built to get there was itself a significant achievement. The deepest a remotely operated vehicle had previously traveled was 6,600 feet, and that vehicle had been difficult to control, with a single arm capable of only crude movements. Thompson's Nemo could operate at nearly 8,000 feet of depth with 2 articulated arms and camera systems sophisticated enough to perform delicate archaeological work. The machine was, in many ways, the real product of the expedition, a tool that could have opened a new frontier in deep ocean science. But what it found on the floor of the Atlantic was gold, and gold changed everything. The recovery operations that followed, from the fall of 1989 through 1991, brought to the surface 532 gold ingots, 7,500 gold coins, and an 80-pound gold bar that was at the time the most valuable single piece of currency in the world. One investor, upon hearing the news, told the Columbus Dispatch that it gave him a very warm feeling. The first haul was driven from the dock in armored cars, flanked by guards carrying automatic weapons, past a crowd of cheering investors and descendants of the original passengers. Thompson's contract entitled him to approximately 17% of the proceeds from future sales, and the investors, some of whom had turned $200,000 into a projected $10 million, believed they were about to become extraordinarily rich. What none of them understood, not yet, was that they had seen the gold for the last time. The lawsuits began almost immediately. 114 separate entities filed claims against Thompson and his companies, including 39 insurance firms that had paid out on the original 1857 cargo and now argued that the recovery of the gold entitled them to its return. An order of Capuchin monks sued, alleging that Thompson had stolen intelligence about the wreck site from a professor they had commissioned to survey the same area. The litigation halted all further recovery operations and trapped the gold that had already been brought to the surface in legal limbo. It would take until 1998 for the courts to award Thompson and his team 92.5% of the treasure, but by then the legal fees and operating costs had consumed more than $30 million. The rare coin market had collapsed, and the investors who had waited a decade for their payday were growing restless. This is where the story shifts from adventure to something more interior, something that has less to do with the mechanics of treasure hunting and more to do with what happens inside a particular kind of mind when the object of a lifelong pursuit becomes a source of unrelenting, inescapable pressure. Thompson's friends and colleagues from this period describe a man being slowly crushed. His marriage ended. His father died. The litigation, which he insisted on managing personally, reading every brief, attending every hearing, sometimes helping write the legal filings himself, consumed years of his life that he had intended to spend doing science. One investor told Columbus Monthly that Tommy was in agony, that he hated the legal crap, but could not bring himself to trust the lawyers enough to step away. In 2000, Thompson negotiated the sale of the recovered gold through the California Gold Marketing Group on behalf of the Recovery Limited Partnership for approximately $50 million. He did not tell the investors he was going to do this until after it was done. When they asked about their returns, Thompson reportedly told them the entire sum had been consumed by accumulated debts and legal fees. There was nothing left to distribute. Around the same time, an amendment to the agreement between Thompson's 2 companies quietly transferred to him personally a payout of $2.1 million and 500 gold coins, restrikes minted from Central America gold that had originally been earmarked as compensation for investors. Thompson's attorney, Keith Golden, would later insist there was nothing clandestine about the arrangement. Noting that Thompson was so honest, he reported the coins on his tax returns. But the investors did not see it that way. What followed is the part of the story that resists easy interpretation, the part that makes Thompson something more complicated than either a folk hero or a con man. By the mid-2000s, Thompson had largely withdrawn from public life. He spent half the year in a rented mansion in Vero Beach, Florida, living under another name, keeping the utilities in the landlord's name by arguing to the power company that celebrities were routinely afforded such privacy. He claimed to suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome and neurological problems that impaired his memory. Investigators would later describe him as one of the smartest fugitives they had ever pursued. His friends described a man who was genuinely unwell. Both descriptions may have been accurate at the same time. In 2005, the first investor lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty were filed. In 2006, crew members from the original expedition sued, claiming they had been cheated out of their promised share of profits. Thompson retreated further. In 2008, he was pulled over during a routine traffic stop in Jacksonville and found to be hiding fake identification, 4 cell phones, and $6,500 in cash beneath his seat. It was a preview of what was coming. In July 2012, a federal judge ordered Thompson to produce the 500 restrike coins, or swear under oath that he did not know where they were. Thompson's responses were vague and circular. On August 13th, the day he was supposed to appear in court for a final reckoning, he simply did not show up. His lawyer said he was out to sea. The judge said the word bullshit from the bench and issued a warrant for Thompson's arrest. Within weeks, Thompson's longtime secretary and companion, Allison Antiquaire, also disappeared. The two were presumed to be together and presumably in possession of millions of dollars in cash and 500 gold coins that no one else had ever seen. The mansion they left behind in Vero Beach told its own story. When a handyman named James Kennedy finally entered the property that October, he found windows sealed with plastic, cabinets collapsed, organic matter growing out of the sink, mold on every surface, hundreds of phone batteries stored in Ziploc bags, maps taped to the walls, and a large plastic tub filled with so many pills that the house smelled like a pharmacy. The garage was packed with bags of trash. Food waste had been thrown into a pile in the backyard. It was, Kennedy said in his deposition, like that television show, Hoarders. Whatever Thompson and Antiquaire had been doing in that house, it did not look like the lifestyle of criminal masterminds enjoying the fruits of a heist. It looked like distress. This is the psychological core that the treasure hunting genre almost never reaches, the thing that numbers like $520 million are designed to obscure. The story of the SS Central America is not, at its most essential level, a story about gold at the bottom of the sea. It is a story about what a particular form of cognitive entrapment does to a human being over decades. Thompson began as a scientist who used treasure as a funding mechanism for deep ocean research. The gold was the means, not the end. But the discovery of the gold generated a legal and financial vortex that consumed the science entirely. And once Thompson was inside that vortex, every year that passed without resolution made it harder to walk away. Psychologists have a term for this, the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in a losing proposition because the accumulated investment feels too large to abandon. But the sunk cost fallacy usually describes people making poor decisions about money. What happened to Thompson was something more totalizing. The gold did not just consume his finances, it consumed his identity, his relationships, his health, and, ultimately, his freedom. He is not the only person this has happened to. Mel Fisher, the legendary treasure hunter who spent 16 years searching for the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha in the Florida Keys, lost his eldest son Dirk, his daughter-in-law Angel, and a diver named Rick Gage when their boat sank during the search in 1975. Fisher kept going. He fought the state of Florida for 8 years, all the way to the Supreme Court for the right to keep what he found. He eventually recovered an estimated $450 million in gold, silver, and emeralds. His company later pleaded no contest to charges of selling counterfeit coins bearing fleet insignia, coins that Fisher had purchased from an associate with a criminal record for precisely that offense, and then sold with his own signed certificate of authenticity. The treasure did not corrupt Fisher in any simple Hollywood sense. It restructured his life so completely that the distinction between the quest and the man ceased to exist. His daily greeting to his staff, repeated every morning for 16 years, was, "Today's the day." It was the mantra of someone who could not allow himself to consider the possibility that today was not, in fact, the day. Because to consider that possibility was to confront the accumulated cost of every previous day that had not been the day. The pattern repeats across the history of underwater salvage with a consistency that suggests something structural rather than anecdotal. Odyssey Marine Exploration, a publicly traded Tampa-based company, spent years and millions of dollars recovering an estimated $500 million in gold and silver coins from a site in the Atlantic, flew 17 tons of treasure to a secure location in Florida, and then lost every single coin in a years-long legal battle with the government of Spain, which proved that the wreck was the Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, a Spanish royal frigate sunk in 1804. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear Odyssey's final appeal. A federal judge later ordered Odyssey to pay Spain an additional $1 million for what the court called bad faith in abusive litigation, finding that Odyssey had known all along that Spain possessed the expertise to identify the wreck and had deliberately avoided asking. The company did not set out to commit fraud, it set out to find treasure. But the logic of the enterprise, the enormous upfront investment, the legal ambiguity, the proximity of life-changing wealth, created conditions in which the boundary between aggressive optimism and deliberate deception became functionally invisible, not just to outside observers, but to the people inside the operation. The San Jose, a Spanish galleon sunk by the British off the coast of Colombia in 1708, carrying what may be $20 billion in gold, silver, and emeralds, is currently the subject of competing claims from Colombia, Spain, a private American salvage company, and indigenous peoples from Bolivia whose ancestors were forced to mine the treasure under colonial rule. The legal and moral complexity of this single wreck is so vast that it is being adjudicated simultaneously before the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Colombian civil courts, and the Court of International Public Opinion. No one knows who will prevail. The treasure has not been recovered, and yet it has already generated decades of litigation, diplomatic crises, and expenditures in the tens of millions. The San Jose may be worth $20 billion at the bottom of the sea. Above the surface, it has produced nothing but cost. This is the arithmetic that the treasure hunting narrative never performs honestly. The genre, whether in books or documentaries or breathless YouTube thumbnails, presents the equation as simple. There is gold down there, and someone needs to go get it. The implied psychology is one of risk and reward, adventure and payoff, but the actual economics of underwater salvage tell a different story. Thompson's expedition cost over $22 million in investor capital and tens of millions more in borrowed funds. The legal battles consume more than $30 million. The gold was sold for roughly $50 million. After debts and fees, the investors received nothing. Thompson spent more than a decade in federal prison. The gold is now dispersed among coin dealers and private collectors. The Nemo, the genuinely revolutionary deep-sea vehicle that Thompson built, is not in a museum. The scientific legacy of the expedition is a footnote. The only thing the Central America story produced in abundance was ruin. The question worth asking is not whether the treasure was real. It was spectacularly real. The question is what happens to a person, to a specific living person with a specific nervous system and a specific history and a specific set of cognitive vulnerabilities when they become the focal point of a conflict between that much money and that much law. Alan King, a psychology professor who studied the subculture of treasure hunters, surveyed over 400,000 participants in a treasure hunt organized by the eccentric art dealer Forrest Fenn, and found that approximately 3/4 were male. Most were natural risk takers, and what attracted them was not primarily the money, but the feeling of mastery, the sense of linking a clue to a location, of being the one who figured it out. King's research identified something that the sunk cost fallacy alone does not capture. The pursuit itself becomes a source of identity, and to abandon the pursuit is not merely to accept a financial loss, but to accept a kind of personal annihilation. Fenn's treasure hunt, which involved a chest of gold and gems hidden somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, killed at least 5 people who went looking for it. The man who finally found it, Jack Stoof, described the experience as the most frustrating of his life and said there were times he sat on a downed tree, exhausted and covered in scratches, and cried alone in the woods. He found the treasure, he won, and the winning sounded like grief. Tommy Thompson was released from federal prison on March 4, 2026, having served more than 10 years. He never disclosed the location of the 500 gold coins. He claimed under oath that he suffered from memory loss and had simply forgotten where they were. A federal judge, after years of holding Thompson in contempt, eventually concluded that he was no longer convinced that further incarceration was likely to coerce compliance. This is a bureaucratic way of saying that the system had applied its maximum pressure to a human being, and the human being had not yielded, whether that represents defiance, mental deterioration, or some novel combination of both. No one outside Thompson's own consciousness can say with certainty. His attorney described him as a scientist who had been destroyed by the very discovery that should have made his career. His investors described him as a thief who had smiled at them while stealing their money. The handyman who found the mansion described something that sounded like neither cunning nor heroism, but rather the final stages of a person who had been consumed. There is a detail from the original sinking of the Central America that tends to get lost in the treasure narratives, a detail that has nothing to do with gold. On the night of September 11th, 1857, as the ship was being battered by a Category 2 hurricane, Captain William Lewis Herndon organized the male passengers into a bucket brigade to bail water from the flooding hold. They worked through the entire night, hundreds of men passing buckets hand to hand in the howling dark, knowing that the ship was sinking and that most of them would not survive. The next morning, when rescue vessels appeared, Herndon ordered the women and children into the lifeboats first and transferred approximately 153 passengers to safety. Then the storm closed in again, and the Central America slipped beneath the surface at 8 o'clock in the evening, taking Herndon and 424 others with it. Herndon never left the deck. 2 Navy ships would later be named in his honor, and his daughter would marry a man who became the 21st President of the United States. The gold that went down with the Central America had been minted in San Francisco and was bound for New York banks that were on the verge of insolvency. Its loss helped trigger a national financial panic. 131 years later, Thompson brought some of that gold back to the surface, and it triggered a different kind of panic, a slower, more personal one, confined to courtrooms and hotel rooms and a moldering mansion in Vero Beach. The gold endured, as gold does. It is in private collections now, behind glass, its provenance carefully documented by coin dealers who note its shipwreck origin as a selling point. What did not endure was the man who found it, or his marriage, or his scientific ambitions, or his investors' trust, or his freedom. The treasure was always real. The question that hovers over the entire history of underwater salvage, the question that no dollar figure can answer, is whether the people who go after it understand what they are actually pursuing, and whether, by the time they find out, it is already too late to stop.